good evening, or perhaps good night. Settle in. Tonight, we embark on a journey back in time, not to the dramatic battles or the grand pronouncements of history, but to the quiet, persistent struggle of daily existence on the American frontier. We'll delve into the minutiae, the often overlooked details that truly defined life for those who pushed westward, seeking new beginnings, often finding only endless toil. Forget the romanticized images of daring cowboys and bustling boomtowns for a moment. Instead, let your mind drift into the rhythmic monotony of building a home from nothing, in a landscape that was both unforgiving and utterly indifferent to human endeavor. Our story begins, as many frontier stories did, with the most fundamental need: shelter. Imagine, if you will, arriving in a vast, untamed expanse. No pre-built structures, no hardware stores, no readily available lumber yards. Just you, your family, perhaps a wagon load of meager possessions, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. The immediate priority was always, invariably, a roof over your head. This wasn't a matter of comfort, but of survival. The elements, whether the blistering summer sun, the biting winter winds, or the sudden, torrential downpours, dictated an urgency that modern life rarely comprehends. For many, the first dwelling was a temporary affair. A tent, if they were fortunate enough to possess one, provided a flimsy barrier against the immediate elements. More often, it was a lean-to constructed from saplings and brush, or perhaps a dugout, a simple excavation into a hillside. These dugouts, humble as they were, offered surprising advantages. They were relatively quick to construct, provided excellent insulation against temperature extremes, and offered a measure of protection from prairie fires or even, on rare occasions, hostile encounters. The process was straightforward yet backbreaking. Find a suitable bank or slope, begin digging, and then reinforce the opening with logs or branches. The roof might be a simple affair of sod laid over timbers, providing a thick, insulating layer that often sprouted grass and wildflowers, blending the dwelling almost seamlessly into the landscape. The ambition, of course, was always to transition from these rudimentary shelters to something more permanent: a log cabin, or in areas where timber was scarce, a sod house. The log cabin, iconic in its representation of frontier life, was a monumental undertaking. It required not just brute strength, but a surprising degree of skill and cooperation. Trees had to be felled, often by hand, with axes and saws, then limbed, cut to length, and painstakingly notched to interlock securely. Each log, immensely heavy, had to be maneuvered into place, often by several individuals straining together. Imagine the rhythmic thud of the axe, the rasp of the saw, the grunts of effort, punctuated by the occasional crack of splitting wood. The soundscape of frontier settlement was one of relentless construction. The chinking, filling the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, or small stones, was equally critical. This seemingly minor detail was the difference between a drafty, unbearable hovel and a relatively weatherproof home. It was a tedious, messy job, often done by women and children, their hands caked in earth, their movements slow and deliberate, ensuring every crack was sealed against the relentless march of the elements. Windows, if they existed at all in the early days, were often simple openings covered with greased paper or animal hides, offering minimal light but some protection. Glass was a luxury, a distant dream for most, arriving only with established trade routes and greater prosperity. In the treeless expanse of the Great Plains, the sod house, or soddy, became the vernacular architecture of necessity. These structures were built from blocks of prairie sod, cut with a special plow designed to slice through the thick, interwoven roots of prairie grasses. These bricks of earth, often 12 to 18 inches wide and 3 to 4 feet long, were heavy, weighing up to 50 pounds each. They were laid in courses, much like traditional bricks, with the grass side down, creating incredibly thick walls that offered superior insulation against both summer heat and winter cold. The roof was typically constructed from timber or brush, overlaid with more layers of sod, creating a living roof that, much like the dugout, could support a small garden or simply blend into the surrounding prairie. The interior of a sod house, though surprisingly comfortable in terms of temperature regulation, often felt damp and earthy. Dust was a constant companion, sifting in through unseen cracks, clinging to everything. Insects and even small rodents found their way into the thick organic walls. Yet for many, the soddy was a sanctuary, a hard-won testament to their resilience. It was their fortress against the vastness, their small claim to permanence in a landscape that demanded constant adaptation. Beyond the dwelling itself, the immediate surrounding area needed to be made habitable. This often involved clearing land for a small garden plot, essential for supplementing the diet. Fences, simple as they might be, perhaps just a few strands of barbed wire if available, or more commonly, split-rail fences constructed from salvaged timber or even stacked stones, were necessary to protect precious crops from wandering livestock or wild animals. A well or access to a natural water source was paramount. Digging a well was another arduous task, often requiring deep excavations by hand, hoping to strike water before exhaustion or collapse. The success or failure of a homestead often hinged on the reliable availability of fresh water. Basic furnishings were crude and often handmade. A table might be a few planks nailed together. Beds were often simple straw mattresses laid on the floor or rudimentary wooden frames. Storage was minimal, relying on trunks or shelves built directly into the walls. Every item possessed had to serve a practical purpose. There was no room for decorative excess. Life was stripped down to its bare essentials, a constant reminder of humanity's fundamental needs when faced with an untamed environment. This initial phase of settlement, focused on establishing basic shelter and access to water and food, was often the most physically demanding, a test of will, ingenuity, and sheer endurance. It set the stage for everything that followed, defining the parameters of daily life in a way that is almost unimaginable to us today. With a rudimentary shelter established and a water source secured, the frontier settlers' gaze inevitably turned to the land itself. The promise of fertile soil was, for many, the primary allure of the West, the dream of independent sustenance and a future built on the fruits of their own labor. Yet this promise was often encased in an incredibly arduous reality. Farming on the frontier was a relentless, back-breaking, and often disheartening endeavor. It wasn't merely about planting seeds. It was about transforming raw wilderness into productive fields, a process that demanded ingenuity, perseverance, and an almost superhuman tolerance for repetitive, manual labor. The first challenge, after simply acquiring the land, was its preparation. Depending on the region, this could mean clearing dense forests, pulling up tenacious prairie sod, or removing countless rocks from stony fields. If timber was abundant, trees had to be felled, stumps painstakingly removed or burned out, and underbrush cleared. This was an ongoing process, often taking years to truly tame a significant acreage. The tools were simple, almost primitive: axes, saws, picks, and shovels. Every inch of cleared land represented hours of sweat and muscle, a testament to sheer human will against an unyielding natural world. On the prairies, the challenge was different but equally formidable: breaking the sod. The native grasses of the Great Plains had incredibly deep, matted root systems that formed a thick, almost impenetrable mat. A standard plow, designed for softer, previously cultivated soil, was utterly useless against this formidable barrier. Specialized breaking plows, with their heavy, sharp blades, were required, often pulled by multiple teams of oxen or horses due to the immense resistance. Even with these specialized implements, the work was agonizingly slow. The plowshare would groan and bite, turning over thick strips of sod that then had to be left to rot for a season or two before they could truly be worked into a viable seedbed. The initial crop, planted directly into the rotting sod, was often meager, a testament to the land's stubborn resistance. Once the land was prepared, the cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting began. The choice of crops was critical and often limited by climate, soil type, and the availability of seeds. Corn was a ubiquitous staple, adaptable and relatively hardy, providing food for both humans and livestock. Wheat, oats, and various vegetables like potatoes, beans, and squash also featured prominently. Seed acquisition was an early hurdle. Often, settlers carried precious small amounts with them, or relied on nascent local markets or even exchanges with Native American tribes who possessed valuable knowledge of indigenous plants. Planting itself was a manual affair. Rows were marked, furrows opened, and seeds dropped by hand, often one by one before being covered over. There were no mechanical planters, no sophisticated fertilizing systems. The success of the crop depended entirely on the quality of the soil, the vagaries of the weather, and the sheer diligence of the farmer. Droughts were a constant, terrifying threat, capable of wiping out an entire season's labor and plunging a family into destitution. Floods, hailstorms, and sudden early frosts could be equally devastating. The frontier farmer lived in a perpetual state of anxiety, their livelihood hanging by the delicate thread of nature's unpredictable temperament. Weeding was an endless chore. Without herbicides, every unwanted plant had to be pulled by hand or hoed, under a blazing sun, often for hours on end. Pests from swarms of grasshoppers that could decimate fields in a matter of days, to smaller, persistent insects, were another constant battle. There were no pesticides, so farmers relied on crude methods like hand-picking pests or burning infested fields, a desperate measure that carried its own risks. The struggle against nature was a daily, grinding reality, a stark contrast to the idealized image of abundant harvests. Harvesting, when it finally arrived, was a period of intense, concentrated labor. Grain was cut with scythes or cradles, then bound into sheaves by hand. Thrashing, separating the grain from the chaff, was a laborious process, often done by flailing the grain by hand or by using animals to trample it. This was dusty, arduous work, requiring every family member, even the youngest children, to contribute. The harvested crops then needed to be stored, often in crude barns or granaries, protected from moisture, rodents, and insects. Any surplus might be transported to the nearest market, often a journey of days or even weeks by wagon over rough trails, hoping to fetch a price that justified the immense effort. The frontier farmer's year was a cycle of repetitive, physically demanding tasks, dictated by the seasons. Spring brought the frantic rush of plowing and planting. Summer was a time of endless cultivation, weeding, and praying for rain. Autumn was dedicated to the exhausting harvest, followed by preparations for winter. Winter, while offering a slight respite from field work, brought its own challenges, protecting livestock, repairing tools, gathering fuel, and simply enduring the cold and isolation. There was little time for leisure, no concept of a work-life balance as we understand it today. Life was work from dawn until dusk every single day. Beyond the major crops, many settlers maintained small kitchen gardens, vital for dietary diversity and freshness. These plots, often tended primarily by women, provided vegetables, herbs, and sometimes small fruits. They were miniature ecosystems of sustenance, carefully nurtured against insects, disease, and encroaching weeds. The ability to grow one's own food was not just a matter of economy, but of survival, ensuring a steady supply of fresh produce when external markets were distant or non-existent. The self-sufficiency nurtured by these small gardens extended to other domestic chores. Everything from making soap to churning butter, from preserving foods through salting or drying to making and repairing clothes, fell under the purview of daily labor. These were not hobbies. They were essential skills for survival, passed down through generations, honed by necessity. The frontier was a crucible forging resilience through the constant, unyielding demands of the land. Having established a foothold, a meager shelter, and begun the arduous task of coaxing sustenance from the soil, the frontier settler then confronted the vast, overarching imperative of resourcefulness. In an environment where every item was precious, every broken tool a crisis, and every need a challenge to be met with ingenuity, self-sufficiency was not merely a virtue. It was the very bedrock of survival. The frontier demanded a constant, inventive adaptation, a willingness to mend, to repurpose, to create from scratch, and to squeeze every last drop of utility from limited possessions. This was a life defined by improvisation, by making do, and by a practical wisdom born of necessity. Consider the tools, for instance. A plowshare might break, an axe handle splinter, a wagon wheel collapse. In a world devoid of readily available blacksmiths, hardware stores, or even spare parts, these malfunctions could halt progress entirely. The settler often had to become a jack of all trades, a crude blacksmith capable of reforging simple implements, a carpenter able to fashion a new handle from a sturdy branch, or a wheelwright with the patience to repair a broken spoke. Scrap metal, salvaged from worn-out implements or abandoned wagons, was a treasure. Nails were hoarded and straightened. Every bit of leather, rope, or cloth was saved, anticipating future repairs. This constant state of repair and repurpose instilled a deep appreciation for materials and an almost instinctive understanding of their potential uses. Clothing, too, was a testament to self-sufficiency. Store-bought fabrics were expensive luxuries, often reserved for special occasions if they were obtained at all. The vast majority of garments were handmade, often from homespun cloth. Wool from sheep, if available, or cotton, provided the raw fibers. The process of transforming these raw materials into wearable fabric was lengthy and labor-intensive. Shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving were all manual tasks, usually performed by the women of the household. Imagine the rhythmic whir of the spinning wheel, the clatter of the loom, these sounds forming a quiet counterpoint to the outdoor labor. Then came the cutting and sewing, often by hand with simple needles and thread. Clothes were patched and repatched until they disintegrated, passed down through families, and then repurposed into rags. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of fabric held potential. Food preservation was another critical skill, extending the bounty of a short growing season into the long, lean months of winter. Without refrigeration, settlers relied on age-old methods: drying, salting, smoking, and pickling. Meat from hunted game or butchered livestock had to be processed quickly. Strips of venison or beef were dried in the sun or smoked over slow fires, creating jerky that could last for months. Pork was often salted down in barrels. Vegetables were dried or pickled in brine. Fruits might be dried or made into jams and preserves if sugar was available, though sugar itself was a luxury. This meticulous, time-consuming work of preservation was not about culinary delight, but about calorie counts, about ensuring that hunger did not become starvation when winter snows isolated the homestead. Beyond cultivated crops, hunting and foraging played vital roles in diversifying the diet and providing essential resources. For many frontier families, wild game, deer, rabbit, squirrel, and various fowl provided much-needed protein. Hunting was not a sport. It was a necessary skill, requiring knowledge of the land, animal behavior, and the patient use of often rudimentary firearms. Every part of the animal was utilized: meat for food, hides for leather, bones for tools, fat for tallow and soap. Foraging for wild edibles like berries, nuts, wild greens, and medicinal plants also supplemented the larder and provided vital nutrients often lacking in a monotonous diet. This intimate knowledge of the local flora and fauna was often learned through trial and error, or sometimes invaluable guidance from Native American neighbors. The concept of waste, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent. Anything that could be repurposed, reused, or recycled was. Tin cans, when they became available, were cut into useful shapes. Glass bottles, if acquired, were treasured. Animal bones might be carved into tools or buttons. Even ash from the fireplace was saved to make lye for soap. This constant cycle of reuse was not driven by environmental consciousness, but by economic necessity and the sheer scarcity of manufactured goods. Every broken item was a puzzle, every discarded piece of material an opportunity. Innovation, born of this self-sufficiency, often led to unique solutions. Settlers built their own furniture, often crude but functional, from whatever wood was available. They fashioned their own cooking utensils from metal scraps or wood. They devised rudimentary heating systems, often relying on efficient wood-burning stoves or fireplaces that were carefully constructed to maximize heat retention. Lamps, when not simple candles, might be dishes of animal fat with a rag wick. Cleanliness was maintained through homemade lye soap and diligent scrubbing, often with brushes made from stiff bristles or bundled twigs. This relentless resourcefulness extended to problem-solving in every aspect of life. If a wagon bogged down in mud, creative solutions were found to extract it. If a tool broke far from home, field repairs were attempted with whatever was at hand. If illness struck, folk remedies, passed down through generations, were employed before considering the expensive and often ineffective services of a distant doctor. The frontier environment was a constant test, demanding not just physical strength but mental agility, a willingness to experiment, and an unwavering belief in one's own capacity to overcome obstacles. It fostered a unique blend of rugged individualism and communal cooperation. As neighbors, though distant, often relied on each other for assistance with major tasks, sharing tools, and lending a hand in times of crisis. The spirit of self-sufficiency was paramount, but it was often tempered by the quiet understanding that, in such a challenging landscape, mutual aid was sometimes the most resourceful tool of all. Having explored the physical demands of frontier life, the relentless toil of building and farming, the ingenious necessity of self-sufficiency, we now turn our attention to the human element, to the intricate balance between desperate isolation and the burgeoning, fragile bonds of community. For the frontier settler, life was a paradox, often profoundly solitary, yet simultaneously dependent on the nascent networks of support that slowly, painstakingly began to knit together the vast, empty landscape. This duality shaped mental landscapes as much as physical ones, defining not just how people lived, but how they endured. Imagine the sheer scale of the isolation. Homesteads were often miles apart, separated by trackless prairie, dense forest, or challenging terrain. The journey to the nearest neighbor, let alone a nascent town, could take hours or even days by wagon or on horseback. This wasn't merely social distance. It was a physical barrier to assistance, to news, to medical aid, and to any form of collective endeavor. For weeks, sometimes months, a family might see no one beyond their own immediate members. The silence, broken only by the sounds of wind, wildlife, or their own domestic efforts, could be deafening. It fostered an intense self-reliance, certainly, but it also bred a quiet, pervasive loneliness that chipped away at the spirit. Communication with the outside world was sparse and slow. Letters, if they arrived at all, took weeks or even months to travel across vast distances, often carried by infrequent stagecoaches or private travelers. News from the East, or from distant relatives, arrived long after events had transpired, often feeling like dispatches from another world. The rhythm of life was entirely local, circumscribed by the immediate needs of the homestead and the slow turning of the seasons. This lack of external input meant that rumors and local gossip, when they did filter through, took on an outsized importance, filling the void of information. Yet from this very isolation, the seeds of community were, paradoxically, sown. When neighbors were few and far between, each one became incredibly valuable. The principle of mutual aid was not an abstract concept but a practical necessity. Major undertakings, too large for a single family, demanded collective effort. A barn raising, for instance, was a quintessential frontier event. Families would travel for miles, converging on a single homestead to collectively cut timbers, raise walls, and lift heavy beams into place. These were not paid endeavors. They were reciprocal acts of kindness, with the understanding that the favor would be returned when another family needed assistance. The event itself, while demanding, was also a rare social gathering, a chance for adults to converse, for children to play, and for a shared meal to be enjoyed. Beyond large-scale projects, daily life often required cooperation. Sharing scarce tools, lending an extra pair of hands for a difficult task like harvesting, or pooling resources for a trip to a distant mill or trading post were common. Women, particularly, formed crucial networks of support. Childbirth, illness, or death in the family would often draw neighbors together, with women providing comfort, practical help with domestic chores, and nursing care. These informal systems of care and exchange were the lifeblood of early communities, existing long before formal institutions like churches or schools. As more settlers arrived, these loose networks began to coalesce into nascent communities. The establishment of a post office, however small, was a significant step, signaling a connection to the wider world and providing a central point for mail and communication. A general store, perhaps just a room in someone's cabin, offered a place to acquire essential goods: sugar, salt, coffee, fabric, and more importantly, served as a vital hub for news and social interaction. These humble establishments were often the first civic spaces, predating dedicated churches or schoolhouses. Religious gatherings, though often infrequent and held in private homes or under the open sky, were profoundly important. They offered spiritual sustenance, certainly, but also a crucial opportunity for social communion. Circuit riders, traveling preachers, were eagerly awaited figures, bringing not just sermons but news from other settlements and a connection to a shared cultural heritage. These gatherings provided a sense of collective identity, a shared purpose beyond the individual struggle for survival. Education for children was a significant challenge amidst the isolation. Early on, it was entirely the responsibility of parents, often mothers, who squeezed lessons into already packed days, relying on what books they might possess. As communities grew, the establishment of a one-room schoolhouse was a monumental achievement. These schools, often built by community effort, served not just as places of learning but as central meeting points for the entire settlement, hosting dances, lectures, and other social events. The teacher, often a young woman, might board with different families, further strengthening community ties. Despite these emerging communal structures, the underlying reality of isolation persisted. Winter snows could cut off homesteads for months. Illness could strike without warning, leaving families to cope alone. The vastness of the landscape remained, a constant reminder of how small and vulnerable each individual human endeavor truly was. This blend of fierce independence and profound need for connection defined the frontier spirit, creating a society where self-reliance was paramount, but where the bonds of neighborliness, forged in shared hardship, were often deeper and more vital than any formal decree. It was a life lived on the edge both geographically and socially, where every handshake carried weight, and every helping hand was a testament to survival. As the frontier advanced, steadily pushing westward, The isolated homesteads and nascent communities we've discussed did not exist in a vacuum. They were planted squarely within landscapes already inhabited, often for millennia, by diverse Native American nations. This created a complex, often volatile, and constantly evolving web of interactions, sometimes cooperative, frequently tense, and tragically often violent. Understanding the day-to-day life of a frontier settler is incomplete without acknowledging the profound, inescapable presence of indigenous peoples and the equally significant, though different, dynamics with other arriving settlers. For many early pioneers, the initial encounters with Native Americans could be a mix of curiosity, fear, and sometimes vital mutual exchange. Indigenous peoples possessed an unparalleled knowledge of the land, its resources, its dangers, its seasonal rhythms. They understood local flora and fauna, sustainable hunting practices, and often the most efficient routes through rugged terrain. In certain instances, particularly during the earliest waves of settlement or in less contested areas, Native Americans might trade furs, hides, and food for European-manufactured goods like tools, blankets, or firearms. Some settlers learned valuable survival skills from their indigenous neighbors, such as tracking, specific hunting techniques, or the preparation of native foods. These moments of peaceful interaction, though often overshadowed by later conflicts, were a genuine part of the frontier experience. However, the relentless westward expansion, driven by the ideology of manifest destiny and the insatiable demand for land, inevitably led to escalating tensions. Settlers viewed the land as a commodity to be claimed, fenced, and cultivated. Native Americans viewed it as a sacred trust, a communal inheritance, and the very foundation of their cultural and spiritual identity. These fundamentally incompatible worldviews were the root cause of much conflict. The arrival of settlers often meant the disruption of traditional hunting grounds, the felling of sacred trees, and the overall encroachment on territories that native nations considered theirs by ancestral right. The day-to-day reality for settlers living in close proximity to native communities was one of constant vigilance. Raids, often driven by desperation for resources, retaliation for perceived wrongs, or resistance to encroachment, were a persistent threat. Homes might be attacked, livestock stolen, or fields destroyed. The fear of such encounters was a pervasive undercurrent in frontier life, leading settlers to build their homes with defensive considerations, to keep firearms readily accessible, and to organize local militias or vigilante groups for self-protection. These groups, while sometimes offering a sense of security, often contributed to the cycle of violence, escalating minor incidents into full-blown conflicts. The U.S. government's policies, oscillating between treaty negotiations and forced removal, further complicated these interactions. Treaties were often broken or ignored as new waves of settlers pushed into native lands, leading to resentment and further conflict. The establishment of forts and military outposts, while intended to protect settlers, often served to further provoke native resistance. The infamous Indian Wars were not just grand battles but a series of smaller, often brutal skirmishes, raids, and retaliatory actions that colored the daily existence of those living on the frontier. The psychological toll of living in such an environment, never knowing when conflict might erupt, was immense. Beyond the direct clashes, the very presence of Native Americans presented a moral and ethical dilemma for many settlers, though perhaps one rarely articulated. They were often simultaneously feared, admired for their resilience and knowledge of the land, and tragically viewed as obstacles to progress. This complex mix of attitudes informed daily interactions, from wary distance to outright hostility, and occasionally to a grudging respect or even genuine friendship. The interactions among other settlers, though less fraught with the existential threat of interethnic conflict, also presented their own set of challenges and opportunities. As discussed, mutual aid was essential. Wagon trains brought together diverse groups of people, forcing them to cooperate for months on end. Disputes over water rights, land boundaries, or even simple disagreements could flare up in isolated communities where law enforcement was distant or non-existent. The establishment of formal legal systems, however rudimentary, was a slow process, meaning that personal reputation, community consensus, and informal justice often held sway. The arrival of different cultural groups, German, Irish, Scandinavian, and other European immigrants, as well as African Americans, some formerly enslaved, seeking new lives, added further layers to the frontier social fabric. Each group brought their own customs, languages, and farming techniques, leading to both cultural enrichment and occasional friction. While the primary shared goal was survival and land acquisition, differences in religion, social customs, or even preferences for certain crops could create subtle divides within emerging communities. Yet the common struggles often transcended these differences, forging a unique American identity born of shared hardship. Towns, when they emerged, became melting pots of these diverse groups, where the dynamics of interaction became even more pronounced. Merchants, saloon keepers, doctors, and craftsmen mingled with farmers and prospectors. The frontier town was often a chaotic, vibrant, and sometimes lawless place, reflecting the raw energies of a society in formation. Here, the everyday interactions moved beyond the isolated homestead to the bustling, dusty street, where rumors, opportunities, and conflicts circulated with greater speed. The presence of military personnel, if a fort was nearby, or government land agents, added another dimension to the daily social landscape. Ultimately, the day-to-day life of a frontier settler was not just about conquering the land. It was about navigating a complex human terrain. It was about learning to coexist, cooperate, or, when necessary, to confront both the indigenous inhabitants and the diverse array of fellow newcomers, each seeking their own version of prosperity and peace in a vast, contested landscape. This ongoing negotiation of human relationships, often conducted under extreme duress, was as much a part of the daily grind as plowing a field or mending a fence. We've explored the sheer physical labor, the cunning resourcefulness, and the intricate social dynamics that define the frontier. But for the settler, daily life was also a perpetual gamble against an array of dangers, some grand and terrifying, others insidious and unseen. Beyond the conflicts with indigenous populations or the struggles with the land itself, the environment harbored its own set of threats: the caprices of nature, the relentless march of disease, and the stark reality of facing illness or injury with incredibly limited medical resources. These perils were not abstract concepts. They were constant companions, shaping decisions, instilling fear, and tragically, often cutting lives short. Consider the environmental hazards. The weather, for instance, was not merely an inconvenience but a force of life and death. Blizzards could descend with terrifying suddenness, trapping families in their homes for weeks, cutting off access to fuel and supplies, and threatening both human and livestock lives. The relentless cold could lead to frostbite, pneumonia, and hypothermia. Conversely, scorching summer heat waves, especially on the prairies, could bake the earth, shrivel crops, and lead to dehydration and heat stroke. Dust storms, particularly in the later periods of intense cultivation, could blot out the sun, fill homes with fine grit, and cause respiratory distress. Then there were the more dramatic, destructive forces. Prairie fires, often ignited by lightning or human carelessness, could sweep across vast expanses with incredible speed, devouring everything in their path. homesteads, crops, livestock, and tragically, sometimes human lives. The constant vigilance against fire, especially during dry seasons, was a heavy psychological burden. Tornadoes, while less frequent, brought unimaginable devastation, capable of leveling a home in seconds. Floods, particularly along river systems, could wash away years of labor, ruin crops, and force families to abandon their nascent settlements. Living on the frontier meant living at the mercy of nature's unpredictable and often brutal power. However, perhaps the most pervasive and insidious threat was disease. Far from established medical centers, sanitation was primitive, and understanding of germ theory virtually non-existent. Diseases that are easily treatable today were often fatal. Cholera, smallpox, typhoid, dysentery, diphtheria, and tuberculosis swept through settlements with alarming regularity, decimating families and communities. Simple infections from cuts or scrapes without antibiotics could quickly turn gangrenous and lead to limb loss or death. Childbirth was a particularly perilous event for both mother and infant, with high mortality rates due to infection, hemorrhage, and lack of skilled medical assistance. Medical care on the frontier was, by modern standards, incredibly rudimentary. Professional doctors were few and far between, usually confined to larger, more established towns. Their training varied wildly, and their understanding of disease was limited. Remedies often included bloodletting, purging, and the administration of various botanical concoctions, many of which were ineffective or even harmful. Opium-based painkillers were common, offering temporary relief but no cure. For most settlers, medical care came from within the family unit. Women, particularly mothers, were the primary caregivers, relying on generations of folk remedies, herbal knowledge, and practical nursing skills. They learned to set broken bones as best they could, to draw out splinters, to make poultices for wounds, and to administer whatever home remedies they possessed. The nearest doctor might be 1,000 miles away, or the nearest trained physician might be days away by horseback, a journey often impossible for someone gravely ill or injured. This meant that every family had to cultivate a basic understanding of first aid and common ailments. Families often carried small medical chests with a handful of patent medicines, a few basic surgical tools, like lancets for lancing boils or simple knives, and perhaps some antiseptic like whiskey or diluted carbolic acid if they could get it. Faith healers, charlatans, and quacks also proliferated, preying on desperation and offering false hope with their dubious elixirs and treatments. Death, therefore, was a much more visible and frequent visitor on the frontier. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high. Adults succumbed to illnesses that today would be minor. Accidents, from farming equipment to runaway horses, were common and often fatal. The process of grief and burial was often a solitary affair, conducted by the family and perhaps a few close neighbors, without the formal rituals or support networks of established communities. Graves were often simple markers on the homestead itself, a poignant testament to lives cut short by the harsh realities of the untamed land. Living with these constant threats, the unpredictable wrath of nature, the silent advance of disease, and the stark absence of advanced medical intervention, fostered a unique form of fatalism mixed with fervent hope. Settlers prayed for good weather, for healthy children, and for a season free from sickness. They learned to observe the subtle signs of nature, to prepare for the worst, and to develop an almost stoic resilience in the face of inevitable hardship. The daily grind was not just about building a life, but about clinging to it in the face of innumerable forces determined to reclaim it. Having charted the perils and necessities of frontier life, from the construction of shelter to the ever-present specter of illness, let us now slow our pace and observe the rhythms that governed each day. The daily life of a frontier settler was not a series of isolated challenges, but a continuous, often monotonous cycle of tasks, dictated by the sun's passage, the changing seasons, and the pressing needs of survival. There was little distinction between work and life. Indeed, life was work, from the first gray light of dawn to the deep, star-strewn darkness of night. And within this relentless cadence, labor was distinctly, though often informally, divided along gender lines, each role indispensable to the survival of the homestead. For the men, the day often began before sunrise. Their primary responsibilities were tied directly to the physical land and the larger infrastructure of the homestead. This meant tending to the livestock, milking cows, feeding horses and oxen, checking on chickens or pigs. The sounds of clattering buckets, lowing cattle, and the crunch of feet underfoot would accompany the dim glow of early morning. Then came the fields, plowing, planting, weeding, cultivating, or harvesting, depending on the season. This work was profoundly physical, demanding immense strength and stamina. The endless expanse of dirt and sky, the rhythmic swing of the scythe, the pull of the plow, the repetitive motion of hoeing, these were the constant companions of the male settler. Beyond agriculture, men were responsible for the ongoing maintenance and construction of the homestead. Fences always needed mending, sheds needed repairs, and new structures had to be built as the family expanded or needed more space. This often involved felling trees, splitting logs, and wrestling heavy timbers into place. Hunting was another significant male task, providing not just meat but also valuable hides and furs. This required skill with firearms, knowledge of tracking, and often long absences from the homestead. Trips to the nearest town or trading post, often days away by wagon, were also typically male duties, involving the sale of surplus produce and the acquisition of essential supplies like salt, sugar, flour, or ammunition. These journeys were fraught with their own dangers and often tested the limits of endurance. For the women, the daily routine, while perhaps less outwardly dramatic than breaking sod or felling trees, was no less arduous or essential. Their sphere of labor was largely centered within and immediately around the home, but its scope was staggering in its breadth and intensity. The day began with preparing breakfast, often over an open hearth or a rudimentary stove, using ingredients that were themselves the product of previous labor: homegrown flour, preserved meat, dried vegetables. Then came the monumental task of water management, hauling buckets of water from the well or nearby stream for cooking, cleaning, and washing. This was a daily, repetitive strain, the sheer weight of water a constant physical burden. Laundry was an all-day event, typically done once a week. It involved heating large vats of water over a fire, scrubbing clothes by hand with homemade lye soap, rinsing them, and then hanging them to dry. It was a physically demanding and often back-breaking chore, especially for large families. Cleaning the small, often dusty and cramped living quarters was another continuous battle against the elements. Dishwashing, lamp cleaning, and the constant sweeping of floors were unending. Beyond these routine chores, women were the primary food processors and preservers. This involved grinding grain, churning butter, making cheese, rendering lard, curing meats, and drying or pickling vegetables and fruits. Every meal was a multi-stage production, starting long before ingredients reached the table. They were also the primary textile producers, spinning yarn, weaving cloth, and then sewing, mending, and patching all the family's clothing. This was a continuous cycle of creation and repair, ensuring the family was adequately clothed against the elements. Childcare was, of course, an omnipresent duty. Large families were common, and children from a young age were integrated into the household's labor force. Women nursed infants, educated younger children, and oversaw the chores assigned to older ones. They were also the primary caregivers for the sick and injured, possessing a vital knowledge of herbal remedies and basic nursing. Childbirth itself was a significant, often perilous event usually attended by a neighboring woman or, if fortunate, a midwife. Children, from the age they could walk, were expected to contribute. Their chores were often scaled to their size and strength, but were no less important. Boys might help with animal tending, fetching water, gathering firewood, or assisting in the fields with lighter tasks like weeding or stone picking. Girls would learn domestic skills alongside their mothers, churning butter, minding younger siblings, carrying water, tending to the kitchen garden, mending and sewing. Play, as we understand it, was a luxury, integrated into work, or snatched in brief moments between tasks. Education was informal, learned through doing, with reading and writing often taught during precious evening hours if a parent had the literacy and the energy. Evenings, after the long day's labor, were not a time for abundant leisure. There were tools to sharpen, clothes to mend, plans to make for the next day. The family might gather around the fireplace or a single lamp, perhaps for a simple meal, a quiet conversation, or a reading from the Bible. The silence of the frontier night would descend, broken only by the sounds of crickets, distant coyotes, or the creak of the house settling. Sleep was not a luxury, it was a necessity, a brief respite before the unyielding demands of another dawn. This gendered division of labor was not rigid in every instance. Necessity often blurred the lines. A woman might help with field work during harvest, or a man might assist with domestic chores if his wife was ill or incapacitated. But generally, the framework held, each gender fulfilling roles that were deemed critical to the functioning of the homestead. This relentless rhythm, the endless repetition of essential tasks, day after day, year after year, forged a unique kind of resilience in the frontier settler. It was a life of profound physical engagement, where every comfort, every meal, every piece of clothing was a direct result of tireless human effort. We've observed the relentless churn of daily labor and the distinct roles played by men, women, and children on the frontier. Now, let us turn our attention to the most fundamental and immediate reward of all that toil: food. The frontier diet was a direct reflection of resourcefulness and necessity, a stark contrast to the diverse and readily available provisions we take for granted today. It was a diet shaped by what could be grown, hunted, gathered, and most critically, what could be preserved against the lean months. For many, every meal was a testament to the ceaseless struggle against scarcity. The foundation of the frontier diet was often grain, primarily corn and wheat. Corn, in particular, was a versatile staple. It could be ground into cornmeal for bread, porridge, or mush, or fed to livestock. Wheat, when successfully grown, provided flour for more palatable breads and baked goods, though acquiring the means to mill it into fine flour was often a challenge. Hand grinding with rudimentary mortars and pestles was slow and inefficient, producing coarse meal. The dream was always to be close enough to a grist mill, where grain could be processed more effectively, though this usually meant paying a fee or giving up a portion of the harvest. The daily bread, in whatever form, was the literal staff of life. Vegetables, usually from the family's small garden plot, supplemented the grain. Potatoes, beans, squash, and root vegetables like carrots and turnips were common, chosen for their hardiness and storage potential. These were vital sources of vitamins and minerals, helping to stave off deficiency diseases. Herbs were grown for both culinary and medicinal purposes. The successful growth of these garden staples was a source of great pride and crucial for the family's health. However, fresh produce was seasonal. The ability to preserve food was paramount for survival through winter. As briefly touched upon, techniques like drying, salting, smoking, and pickling were not quaint traditions, but essential survival skills. Meat, whether from domesticated animals or wild game, was often salted heavily in barrels or smoked in a smokehouse, a process that took days and required careful tending of slow, smoldering fires. Strips of meat, like venison or beef, were cut thin and dried in the sun or near a fire, transforming them into tough, chewy, but long-lasting jerky. Pork was often salted down in barrels. Vegetables were dried, often strung up near the fireplace or pickled in vinegar or brine. Fruits, when available, were dried, sometimes stewed or made into preserves if sugar was accessible. Sugar was an expensive commodity, often reserved for medicinal purposes or rare treats. Molasses or honey, if acquired, were more common sweeteners. Protein sources beyond cultivated crops were vital, and this is where hunting and foraging came to the fore. For many frontier families, wild game was not a luxury but a necessary supplement to the diet, especially in the early stages of settlement before agricultural yields were reliable. Deer, elk, bison on the plains, rabbits, squirrels, and various wild fowl provided essential protein and fat. Hunting was a skill passed down, requiring knowledge of the local environment, animal behavior, and the patient art of stalking. Firearms, when available, were prized possessions, meticulously maintained. Trapping smaller game was also common. Every part of a hunted animal was utilized. The meat, of course, was consumed fresh or preserved. Hides were tanned for leather, bones used for tools or buttons, sinews for thread, and fat rendered into tallow for candles or soap. Nothing was wasted. This comprehensive use of animal resources was a testament to the frontier ethos of maximizing every available scrap. Foraging also played a crucial role. Wild berries, nuts, mushrooms, if identified correctly and safely, and edible wild greens provided crucial vitamins and flavor that otherwise would have been absent. Knowledge of these wild edibles was often learned through necessity, trial and error, or from indigenous peoples who possessed centuries of accumulated wisdom about local plants. Medicinal plants gathered from the wild were often the first and only line of defense against illness. Despite these efforts, the frontier diet was often monotonous and nutritionally unbalanced. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal. Dairy products were limited, especially in areas without good pasture. Vitamin deficiencies were common, leading to conditions like scurvy from lack of vitamin C and pellagra from lack of niacin, often seen in corn-heavy diets. Dental health was poor, exacerbated by coarse grains and lack of proper hygiene. Digestion issues were frequent due to the heavy, fibrous diet. The sheer physical exertion required by frontier life meant that caloric intake needed to be high, and the focus was often on quantity over nutritional variety. Meals were simple, hearty affairs. Breakfast might be porridge or corn mush, perhaps with some dried meat. Dinner, the midday meal, was typically the largest, often a stew or boiled meat with vegetables. Supper, the evening meal, was lighter, perhaps leftovers or bread with butter. There was little concept of snacking. Water, milk, or sometimes weak tea or coffee, if available, were the common beverages. Alcoholic beverages like whiskey or homemade beer were sometimes consumed, especially by men, for warmth, courage, or simply as a social lubricant in the absence of other forms of entertainment. The entire process of food acquisition, preparation, and consumption on the frontier was a daily masterclass in endurance. It wasn't about culinary delight, but about survival. The constant awareness of where the next meal would come from, the labor involved in securing it, and the careful management of every morsel instilled a deep-seated reverence for sustenance. This intimate relationship with food, born of scarcity and toil, defined a profound aspect of the frontier settlers' existence, leaving little room for complacency or waste. We have charted the formidable physical demands of frontier life, the constant battles against the elements, and the pervasive scarcity that shaped every meal. Now let us consider the less tangible yet equally vital aspects of human existence: the pursuit of knowledge, the solace of entertainment, and the rare, precious moments of leisure. For the frontier settler, these were not entitlements but hard-won privileges, often rudimentary, always cherished, and deeply integrated into the fabric of survival itself. Education, as we understand it today, was a luxury, not a given. In the earliest stages of settlement, formal schooling was virtually non-existent. Parents, often the mothers, became the primary educators, squeezing lessons into the chaotic rhythm of daily chores. This meant teaching basic literacy, reading from the family Bible or a handful of cherished books, practicing handwriting on slate or scrap paper. Arithmetic might be learned through practical applications, like calculating seed requirements or counting livestock. Geography was the immediate landscape, science was the weather and the soil, and history was the stories told by elders. This informal, home-based education, while foundational, was often inconsistent, constrained by the parents' own literacy levels, the availability of materials, and sheer exhaustion. As more settlers arrived and communities began to coalesce, the one-room schoolhouse slowly emerged as a beacon of progress. These humble structures, often built through community effort with salvaged materials, became vital hubs. A single teacher, often a young woman from the East, or a local settler with some education, would instruct all grades simultaneously, from the youngest beginners learning their alphabet to older children grappling with more advanced sums. The curriculum was basic: reading, writing, and arithmetic with some history and geography. Resources were scarce: a few worn textbooks, a shared slate, chalk, but the commitment to learning, seen as a pathway to a better future, was often fierce. The school day was often punctuated by chores, as children would walk miles to school, tend to animals before and after, and contribute to household labor. Beyond the formal or semi-formal education, practical knowledge was paramount. Children learned through doing, through apprenticeship to their parents. Boys learned farming, hunting, and building from their fathers. Girls learned cooking, sewing, preservation, and childcare from their mothers. This hands-on education, while lacking academic rigor, produced generations of highly skilled and adaptable individuals, perfectly suited to the demands of their environment. Entertainment and leisure, far from being separate categories, were often intertwined with work or with simple social gatherings. There were no movie theaters, no radio, no television, no internet. Diversions were homemade, requiring active participation rather than passive consumption. Music was often a deeply cherished form of entertainment. Fiddles, banjos, and guitars, if a family was fortunate enough to possess them, provided accompaniment for singing, storytelling, and rare dances. Community dances, held in a newly built barn or a larger cabin, were eagerly anticipated events, bringing together families from miles around for an evening of lively music, simple steps, and much-needed social interaction. Storytelling was a central form of entertainment, especially during long winter evenings by the fireplace. Tales of adventure, family histories, religious parables, and local gossip filled the quiet hours. Reading aloud from the Bible or a treasured novel was another common pastime, bringing the family together and transporting them, if only for a short while, beyond the confines of their isolated homestead. Letter writing, though a slow form of communication, was also a form of connection and a creative outlet, allowing settlers to share their experiences and feelings with distant loved ones. Simple games occupied children, often involving natural materials, sticks, stones, dirt, or homemade toys. Adults might play cards, checkers, or other board games if they had them. Picnics and informal gatherings centered around food and conversation sometimes occurred during fairer weather, breaking the monotony of solitary labor. Hunting and fishing, while primarily for sustenance, also offered moments of sport and enjoyment. Religious services, as mentioned before, were not just spiritual events but crucial social gatherings. They provided a sense of community, a connection to shared values, and a brief respite from the relentless physical demands. Attending church, even if it meant traveling for hours, was a profound act of both faith and social necessity. Holidays, though celebrated with far less pomp than today, were deeply meaningful. Christmas, Thanksgiving, and the 4th of July were marked by special meals, family gatherings, and perhaps a rare gift. These were moments to pause, to reflect, and to reinforce family bonds in the face of hardship. For those living in areas with established military forts or trading posts, these special occasions might bring slightly larger community events, like fairs or parades, offering a glimpse of a broader world. Ultimately, leisure on the frontier was not about idleness. It was about necessary pauses, about finding small joys within a demanding life. It was about shared laughter during a communal barn raising, the quiet comfort of a story told by firelight, the simple pleasure of a familiar hymn sung in unison. These moments of connection, of mental stimulation, and of simple human enjoyment were vital for maintaining morale, for reminding settlers that beyond the endless toil, there was still beauty, fellowship, and meaning to be found in their harsh, beautiful new world. They were the threads of light woven into a tapestry often dominated by shadow, essential for binding the human spirit to the relentless demands of the land. We have delved into the economic struggles and the persistent scarcity that define the frontier. Now let us consider the very sinews that connected these isolated lives to one another and to the wider world. The primitive, often perilous, systems of transportation and communication. For the frontier settler, the movement of people, goods, and information was not the swift, ubiquitous process we know today, but an arduous, time-consuming endeavor that profoundly shaped their daily routines, their sense of connection, and their very understanding of the world beyond their immediate horizon. The dream, for many, began with land acquisition. The various land acts passed by the U.S. government, such as the Preemption Act and later the Homestead Act, offered the promise of cheap or even free land. But free was a deceptive term. While the land itself might not cost much initially, there were always filing fees, surveying costs, and often hidden expenses associated with securing a clear title. More importantly, the land required significant investment of labor and, crucially, time before it could yield any return. Settlers often arrived with limited capital, perhaps just enough to purchase basic tools, a wagon, a team of animals, and a few months' worth of provisions. Every dollar counted, and every penny spent was weighed against immediate necessity. Once on the land, the pressure of debt quickly became a pervasive shadow. Many settlers borrowed money, often at high interest rates, to finance their migration, purchase essential equipment, or tide them over during the first few lean years before their crops could produce a surplus. A bad harvest, an unexpected illness, or the loss of livestock could quickly plunge a family into insurmountable debt, leading to foreclosure and the loss of everything they had worked for. The fear of failure and the very real prospect of losing their hard-won homestead was a constant, gnawing anxiety. Financial ruin was a far more common end than the romanticized image of striking it rich. The economy of the frontier was primarily an agricultural one, driven by the cycle of planting and harvesting. Settlers aimed to produce enough food for their own consumption, with any surplus intended for sale. However, market access was a significant challenge. Farms were often isolated, miles from the nearest town or railhead. Transporting crops over long distances by wagon was slow, costly, and arduous, especially for bulky goods like grain. This limited the range of marketable produce and often forced settlers to accept whatever price local merchants or middlemen offered, which was frequently low, barely covering the costs of production and transport. Bartering was a much more common form of exchange than cash transactions. Many everyday needs were met through direct trade of goods and services within the nascent community. A farmer might exchange a portion of his corn crop for a neighbor's labor in building a fence, or a woman might trade her homemade soap for eggs or a piece of cloth. This informal economy, built on trust and mutual need, was the lifeblood of isolated settlements, allowing necessities to circulate without the constant need for scarce hard currency. While efficient for local needs, it didn't generate wealth for expansion or for purchasing goods from outside the immediate area. The general store served as a vital nexus of frontier commerce. It was often the only place where settlers could purchase manufactured goods, sugar, salt, coffee, kerosene, tools, fabric, or patent medicines. These stores often operated on a credit system, allowing settlers to buy on account against the promise of future harvests or earnings from trapping or other ventures. This system, while providing crucial access to goods, could also deepen debt, as settlers often accumulated larger tabs than they could easily pay off, especially during periods of economic downturn or poor harvests. The store owner, often the most prosperous individual in a settlement, held significant economic power. Beyond agricultural products, other economic ventures existed, though often supplementary. Hunting and trapping provided valuable furs and hides that could be sold to traders, offering a crucial source of cash income, especially in the early years. Lumbering was another opportunity in timber-rich areas, with settlers cutting and selling logs or milled lumber. Some settlers might engage in freighting, using their wagons to transport goods for others for a fee, while others might dabble in prospecting if minerals were discovered nearby. These diverse activities were often born of necessity, providing alternative income streams when farming alone wasn't enough. The value of labor itself was a core economic asset. With minimal machinery, human effort was the primary engine of production. Children contributed from a young age, and the ability to work tirelessly was highly valued. Hiring outside labor was rare and expensive. Instead, as noted, collective workbees or reciprocal exchanges of labor were the norm. This emphasis on self-reliance meant that every able-bodied person contributed directly to the family's economic survival. The frontier economy was also subject to wider market fluctuations and national financial panics, which could have devastating effects on isolated communities. A sudden drop in commodity prices back east could wipe out a farmer's expected income, making it impossible to pay debts or purchase supplies. The distance and lack of immediate information meant settlers were often blindsided by these larger economic forces, leaving them vulnerable to forces entirely beyond their control. Despite the pervasive challenges, the dream of economic independence and prosperity was a powerful motivator. The notion of owning one's own land, free from landlords or creditors, was a deeply held aspiration, even if the reality was often a life of grinding poverty and constant financial strain. The careful management of scant resources, the ceaseless pursuit of a marketable surplus, and the quiet struggle against debt were not just economic activities. They were integral components of the daily endurance test that defined the life of a frontier settler, shaping their decisions, their anxieties, and their persistent hopes for a better future. We have contemplated the invisible anxieties and profound isolations that define the inner world of the frontier settler. Now, let us return to the tangible, to the very instruments that allowed them to carve out an existence from the wilderness, their tools, and the rudimentary technologies that underpinned their daily struggle. Far from being a static period, the frontier was a crucible of incremental innovation, where every piece of equipment, every ingenious adaptation, served as a direct extension of human will against the unyielding forces of nature. The primary mode of overland transportation for goods and families was the wagon, often pulled by oxen or horses. These were not merely vehicles but mobile homes, carrying all of a family's worldly possessions across vast, untamed landscapes. The journey itself, whether to reach a new homestead or to travel to the nearest trading post, was a monumental undertaking. Roads, where they existed at all, were little more than widened trails, deeply rutted by previous wagons, often turning into impassable quagmires in wet weather or dusty, teeth-jarring tracks in the dry season. Rivers had to be forded, sometimes at great risk, or crossed by rudimentary ferries, often operated by individuals hoping to earn a few precious dollars. Bridges were rare luxuries. A trip to the nearest town, even if only a few dozen miles away, could consume days of a settler's precious time. It required careful planning, packing food for the journey, ensuring the animals were fit, and being prepared for breakdowns, bad weather, or encounters with wildlife. For those traveling across vast distances, like the Oregon Trail or other major migration routes, the wagon train became a temporary moving community, sharing the burdens and dangers of the journey. The slow pace, often just 10-15 miles a day, meant that every mile gained was a testament to endurance. For individuals, horseback riding was the quickest way to travel, used for scouting, hunting, visiting distant neighbors, or making urgent trips. But even this was limited by the horse's endurance, the rider's skill, and the dangers of the open land. Walking, of course, was always an option, often undertaken by those who could afford no other means, a testament to sheer human resolve, though limited to shorter distances. Water transportation, where available, offered a more efficient, though still hazardous, alternative. Rivers like the Missouri, Ohio, and later the Mississippi served as vital arteries for flatboats, keelboats, and eventually steamboats. These vessels could carry heavier loads and often moved faster than wagons overland. However, they faced their own perils: snags, sandbars, unpredictable currents, and the constant threat of boiler explosions on steamboats. For settlers near navigable waterways, these rivers were lifelines, connecting them to distant markets and sources of supply, albeit at a slow and often irregular pace. The advent of the railroad in later periods of frontier expansion brought a revolutionary change, though its impact was gradual. Initially, rail lines were limited, serving only specific routes. But as they expanded, particularly with the completion of transcontinental lines, they dramatically reduced travel times and shipping costs. Suddenly, a journey that took months by wagon could be completed in days. Goods could be transported more efficiently, opening up new markets for agricultural products and bringing manufactured goods to previously isolated areas. The railroad spurred the growth of towns along its lines, transforming desolate landscapes into bustling economic centers. However, for many remote homesteads, the nearest railhead might still be days away, meaning the arduous wagon journey remained a part of their daily reality for decades. Coupled with the challenges of transportation were the severe limitations of communication. Information traveled at the speed of the fastest horse or the most reliable steamboat. News from the East, government decrees, or even personal letters from distant relatives could take weeks or months to arrive, often reaching settlers long after the events they described had become historical footnotes. This created a profound sense of temporal as well as physical isolation, with the outside world feeling distant and disconnected. The establishment of a post office, even a rudimentary one in a settler's cabin or general store, was a monumental step forward. It provided a central point for mail delivery and collection, and mail routes, though often infrequent and circuitous, slowly began to connect scattered settlements. The arrival of the mail carrier was often a major event, eagerly awaited for news, however old, from beyond the immediate horizon. Letters were precious commodities, often read and reread, providing vital emotional connections to family and friends left behind. Informal communication networks were equally crucial. Travelers, peddlers, and circuit riders served as human conduits of news, carrying stories, rumors, and information from one settlement to the next. They were vital for sharing local developments, weather patterns, and news of opportunities or dangers. Word of mouth was often the primary source of intelligence, making local gossip and anecdotal reports highly significant. The telegraph, appearing in later frontier periods, was another transformative technology, bringing near-instantaneous communication. However, its reach was initially limited to major towns and military outposts. For the vast majority of isolated settlers, the telegraph remained a distant marvel, its impact felt indirectly through faster market prices or the rapid deployment of military forces. Ultimately, the limitations of transportation and communication underscored the daily challenges of frontier life. Every journey was an undertaking, every piece of news a precious commodity. These slow, arduous lifelines reinforced the sense of self-reliance and localism, shaping a society where immediate surroundings held paramount importance. The constant effort required to bridge distances, both physical and informational, was a subtle but pervasive force, reminding settlers daily of their small place in a vast, untamed, and often disconnected world. We have systematically laid bare the tangible challenges of the frontier: the back-breaking labor, the economic precariousness, the dangers of nature, and the sheer difficulty of connection. But now let us turn our gaze inward, to the less visible yet equally profound burdens that weighed upon the frontier settler. The psychological and emotional tolls of relentless isolation, pervasive uncertainty, and unyielding hardship. For all the talk of rugged individualism and stoic resilience, pioneering life was a crucible for the human spirit, shaping minds and hearts in ways both profound and often deeply painful. Perhaps the most pervasive emotional challenge was loneliness. As we've discussed, homesteads were often vast distances apart, and contact with other human beings could be infrequent. For weeks or months, a family might be the sole occupants of their small universe, surrounded by an overwhelming expanse of land and sky. This profound isolation was particularly acute for women, who often spent their days confined to the homestead, their only adult company being their husband, whose own conversation might be limited after a day of strenuous labor. The absence of familiar faces, the lack of gossip, the void of casual conversation, these seemingly minor deprivations could accumulate, leading to deep feelings of solitude and desolation. This isolation, coupled with the relentless physical demands and constant uncertainty, contributed to significant mental health challenges. While the terminology of depression or anxiety wasn't common, the symptoms were undoubtedly present. Anecdotal evidence from diaries and letters suggests widespread struggles with melancholia, despondency, and a pervasive sense of being overwhelmed. For some, the unending struggle against nature, the fear of crop failure, illness, or attack, the constant fear of not being able to provide for one's family led to a crushing despair. The lack of intellectual stimulation, beyond the immediate practicalities, could also foster a sense of ennui or mental stagnation. The dreams versus reality dichotomy also weighed heavily. Many came west with romanticized notions of abundant land, quick prosperity, and a simpler life. The reality was often a rude awakening, backbreaking labor for meager returns, constant danger, and a stark simplicity that bordered on deprivation. The gap between expectation and lived experience could be a source of profound disillusionment. Settlers had often burned their bridges with their past lives, selling everything, leaving family behind, making retreat a humiliating and economically ruinous prospect. This sense of irreversible commitment, coupled with overwhelming difficulties, could lead to feelings of being trapped. The loss of social structures and familiar comforts was another quiet burden. Leaving behind established communities, churches, schools, and even simple social customs could be disorienting. The daily rituals that provided comfort and meaning in their former lives were gone, replaced by a raw, unadorned existence focused solely on survival. This cultural dislocation, particularly for immigrants struggling with a new language and customs on top of everything else, added another layer of psychological stress. Yet, despite these immense pressures, resilience was a defining characteristic of many who endured. The very act of facing daily challenges and overcoming them, however small, fostered a sense of self-reliance and grit. There was a profound satisfaction in building something from nothing, in seeing a field grow from wild prairie, in providing for one's family through sheer effort. This tangible progress, however slow, offered a powerful counterweight to despair. Faith, for many, provided an essential anchor. Regular Bible reading, prayer, and the occasional visit from a circuit rider offered spiritual solace and a framework for understanding their trials. The belief in a higher power, and the conviction that their struggles were part of a divine plan or a righteous endeavor, helped many to persevere through unimaginable hardship. Shared hymns and sermons, even in isolated gatherings, reinforced a sense of shared purpose and hope. The simple act of endurance itself, day after day, built a certain mental toughness. Settlers learned to live with uncertainty, to accept setbacks, and to find strength in their own capacities. They celebrated small victories, a successful harvest, the birth of a healthy child, the completion of a new structure, with a depth of appreciation that might seem excessive to modern sensibilities, but was entirely proportional to the effort invested. The presence of family was a dual-edged sword. While children and spouses were often the driving force behind the decision to move west, and the reason for enduring, they were also a source of constant anxiety. The vulnerability of children to illness, the dangers faced by a spouse, the heavy reliance on each family member's labor, all created intense emotional bonds but also immense fear of loss. The death of a child or a spouse, an all too common occurrence, was a devastating blow, often faced with little external support. Ultimately, the psychological and emotional landscape of the frontier was as vast and untamed as the physical one. It was a space where the human spirit was tested by isolation, fear, and the relentless grind of survival. While the popular narrative often highlights the triumphs of courage and independence, the quiet, persistent struggles with loneliness, despair, and the weight of immense responsibility were an equally integral part of the day-to-day life. These unseen burdens, borne largely in silence, reveal the true depth of human resilience required to tame a wilderness, not just with axe and plow, but with the unwavering strength of the mind and heart. We have contemplated the invisible anxieties and profound isolations that define the inner world of the frontier settler. Now, let us return to the tangible, to the very instruments that allowed them to carve out an existence from the wilderness, their tools, and the rudimentary technologies that underpinned their daily struggle. Far from being a static period, the frontier was a crucible of incremental innovation, where every piece of equipment, every ingenious adaptation, served as a direct extension of human will against the unyielding forces of nature. The initial arsenal of the settler was remarkably simple, often limited to what could be transported in a wagon or purchased with meager savings. The axe was paramount. It felled trees for cabins and fences, split firewood for warmth and cooking, and cleared land for cultivation. Its rhythmic thud was the signature sound of early settlement. Alongside it, the saw, though slower, allowed for more precise cuts. These weren't the power tools of today. They were hand tools, requiring immense muscle, skill, and constant sharpening. A dull axe was not just inefficient, it was dangerous. For breaking ground, the plow was indispensable. As we noted, the tough prairie sod required specialized breaking plows, heavier and more robust than those used on tilled eastern lands. These were engineering marvels of their time, designed to cut through dense root systems. Subsequent plows for annual cultivation were lighter, but still required significant effort to guide through the earth. The development of the steel plow by inventors like John Deere was a critical innovation, allowing the sticky prairie soil to slide off the blade rather than cling to it, making cultivation significantly less arduous and accelerating settlement of the plains. Beyond these large implements, a host of smaller essential tools filled the settlers' kit. Shovels and spades for digging wells and foundations, hoes for weeding, hammers for construction, and a variety of knives for countless tasks, from food preparation to hide processing. Every tool was a precious commodity, rarely replaced and meticulously cared for. Repairing a broken tool was a daily necessity, often involving makeshift blacksmithing, woodworking, or leatherwork, all done by hand with limited resources. Firearms, typically rifles or shotguns, were not just tools for defense against wild animals or hostile encounters, but vital instruments for hunting, providing essential protein for the family. The daily ritual of cleaning, loading, and maintaining these weapons was a common one, reflecting their importance. Ammunition was carefully conserved, and powder and shot were often prepared at home. The concept of technology on the frontier was less about complex machinery and more about simple mechanical advantages and adaptations. The well sweep or hand pump for drawing water, the spinning wheel and loom for producing textiles, the churn for making butter. These were the daily technologies that transformed raw materials into usable goods. They were operated by hand, relying on leverage, friction, and repetitive motion, but they greatly amplified human effort. Innovation on the frontier was rarely about grand inventions. Instead, it was an iterative process, driven by immediate problems and local resources. It was the farmer who devised a better way to hitch his oxen to the plow, or the woman who found a more efficient method for drying berries. It was the collective knowledge shared at a barn raising about the best way to notch logs, or the trial and error discovery of which wild plants were edible or medicinal. This bottom-up, need-driven innovation was constant and pervasive, though often unrecorded. The construction of the sod house itself was a prime example of frontier innovation, a direct response to the scarcity of timber on the plains. The creation of a specialized sod plow allowed settlers to utilize the very earth beneath their feet as a building material, turning a perceived disadvantage into a functional solution. Similarly, the construction of intricate dugouts along riverbanks or hillsides reflected an ingenious use of the natural landscape for shelter and insulation. As communities grew, small-scale industrial innovations began to appear. The grist mill, powered by water or wind, revolutionized grain processing, saving settlers countless hours of hand grinding. The sawmill, where water power could be harnessed, allowed for the efficient production of lumber, making sturdier, more comfortable homes possible. These early industries were communal assets, essential for the growth and development of the settlement, and often required collective investment or the entrepreneurial spirit of a few individuals. The constant push for greater efficiency, however minor, underscored every aspect of daily life. Even something as simple as the design of a fence or the layout of a garden reflected practical innovation. The decision to use barbed wire when it became available drastically reduced the labor required for fencing, though it sparked controversy and even conflict in some areas. These small advancements, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, cumulatively eased the burden of daily life and allowed settlers to shift their energies towards further development. The frontier was not a static environment where people simply endured with primitive tools. It was a dynamic landscape that forced continuous adaptation, invention, and improvement. Every broken tool repaired, every new technique learned, every small efficiency gained, represented a micro-innovation that collectively contributed to the eventual taming of the land. These were the quiet triumphs of human ingenuity, playing out daily in countless isolated homesteads, ensuring that the relentless work of survival was just a little bit less burdensome, a little bit more hopeful with each passing year. We have contemplated the ingenuity that allowed settlers to adapt to the wilderness, harnessing simple technologies to ease their burdens. But much of that ingenuity, much of the very possibility of sustained life on the frontier, rested upon another crucial element: the indispensable partnership with animals. Beyond the wild game hunted for sustenance, domesticated livestock, horses, oxen, cattle, pigs, chickens, were not merely possessions. They were living, breathing tools, food sources, and silent companions whose health and productivity directly correlated with the survival and prosperity of the homestead. The draft animals, primarily oxen and horses, were perhaps the most critical. Oxen, though slower, possessed incredible strength and endurance, making them ideal for the arduous task of breaking tough prairie sod or hauling heavy logs for cabin construction. Their plodding, steady pace was a testament to the persistent, unhurried nature of frontier labor. Horses, while faster and more versatile for riding and lighter plowing, were more expensive to acquire and maintain, and more susceptible to disease or injury. A good team of draft animals represented a significant investment, often a family's largest asset after the land itself. Their care, feeding, watering, shoeing, and treating ailments, was a daily, non-negotiable duty, vital for the entire homestead's functionality. The loss of an animal due to illness, accident, or theft could be a devastating economic blow, setting a family back for years. Cattle were another cornerstone of the frontier economy and diet. Beyond providing meat for immediate consumption or preservation, cows produced milk, which could be churned into butter or made into cheese, essential sources of fat and protein. The daily milking chore, often performed by women or children, was a fixed point in the homestead's rhythm. Calves grew into new draft animals or future beef. Cattle drives, though more characteristic of later, larger ranching operations, illustrate the immense value placed on these animals, sometimes requiring perilous journeys to market. The sounds of lowing cattle, the jingle of cowbells, and the careful guarding of herds were integral to the sensory landscape of a settled frontier. Pigs were perhaps the ultimate frontier animal for sheer utility and ease of keeping. They were remarkably self-sufficient, capable of foraging for much of their own food in forests or open range, and they reproduced quickly. Their primary value lay in their meat and fat. Pork could be easily cured by salting and smoking, providing a reliable source of protein through the long winter months. Lard rendered from pig fat was essential for cooking, for making soap, and even for rudimentary lamp fuel. A settler with a healthy drove of pigs possessed a significant hedge against hunger. Chickens, though smaller, provided consistent and invaluable contributions. Eggs for immediate consumption and occasional meat. They required less space and feed than larger animals and were often the responsibility of the children to tend. The daily collection of eggs was a small but steady harvest, offering a welcome dietary supplement. Their presence added to the pervasive, bustling sounds of the homestead, with their clucking and scratching. The care and management of livestock were woven into the very fabric of daily life. Animals needed pasture or forage, often requiring settlers to carefully manage their limited land or allow animals to range freely. a practice that sometimes led to disputes over fences and property lines. Water was essential, meaning animals had to be driven to a stream or well multiple times a day. Shelters, though often crude, were necessary for protection from harsh weather and predators. Sickness in the herd could spread quickly, and with no veterinarians, settlers relied on folk remedies, observation, and grim experience to try and save their animals. Birthing seasons were periods of intense vigilance, with the survival of new offspring critical for the growth of the herd. The relationship between settlers and their animals was deeply practical, yet often imbued with a quiet sense of dependence and even affection. These were not pets in the modern sense, but they were partners in the relentless struggle for survival. The success of a harvest depended on the strength of the oxen. The family's winter diet rested on the fatness of the pigs. The daily chore of milking, feeding, and tending to these creatures fostered an intimate connection, a mutual reliance that transcended mere ownership. The absence of reliable animal husbandry was a common reason for frontier failure. Settlers unaccustomed to caring for livestock, or those who lost their animals to disease or predators, often found themselves unable to sustain their homesteads. The skills of a good stockman, knowing how to break an animal, how to treat common ailments, how to breed for improvement, were as valuable as a farmer's knowledge of the soil. Even the wild animals that were hunted played a vital, if different, role. Beyond food, their hides provided leather for clothing, blankets, and straps. Their fat could be rendered, their bones used for tools. This intricate ecological dance, where domesticated animals served as steady providers and wild ones offered crucial supplements, defined the delicate balance of resource management on the frontier. The daily sounds, smells, and movements of these creatures were a constant reminder of the profound interconnectedness of life on a frontier homestead, where human survival was inextricably linked to the health and vitality of their animal partners. We have systematically charted the concrete and abstract realities of the frontier settlers' existence, from the construction of their rudimentary homes to the vital role of their animal partners. But overarching all these daily struggles and triumphs was an unseen, immutable force that governed every aspect of life. The relentless, often brutal dictates of the seasons and the unhurried, natural rhythm of time. For the frontier settler, time was not measured by clocks or schedules in the modern sense, but by the arc of the sun, the phases of the moon, and most powerfully, by the profound transformations of the natural year. Spring, when it finally arrived, was a period of frantic, renewed energy. After the long, isolating grip of winter, the thawing earth, the budding trees, and the return of birds signaled the urgent imperative of planting. This was a race against time. The ground had to be plowed, seeds acquired and sown, and gardens prepared before the narrow window of optimal growing conditions closed. Livestock, often weakened by winter, needed careful attention as fresh forage became available. Spring meant endless hours in the fields, the air filled with the smells of damp earth and new growth, and the quiet optimism that this year, perhaps, the harvest would be bountiful. It was a time of immense physical exertion, preparing the foundation for the year's sustenance. Summer brought the long, hot days of relentless cultivation and maintenance. The sun, often a merciless overseer, dictated the pace of work. Weeding was a continuous battle against nature's determination to reclaim the cultivated land. Crops needed constant tending, irrigation if water was scarce, and protection from pests and disease. This was also the time for many construction and repair projects, mending fences, building additions, or digging new wells when the ground was drier. Days were long, beginning before dawn and often stretching until dusk, with only brief pauses for meals. The heat and the biting insects added to the physical discomfort, making endurance a daily test. For the settler, summer was a period of sustained, backbreaking effort, the future harvest hanging in a precarious balance. Autumn, for those fortunate enough to see their crops mature, was the season of harvest. This was perhaps the most intense period of concentrated labor. Grains had to be cut, threshed, and stored quickly before the onset of bad weather. Vegetables and fruits had to be gathered and preserved through drying, salting, or pickling. Livestock might be slaughtered and processed for winter meat. There was an urgency born of knowing that the family's survival over the coming cold months depended entirely on the success of these few weeks. Communal gatherings like corn husking bees or apple parings offered rare moments of shared labor and festivity, turning a monumental chore into a social event. The crisp air, the vibrant colors of changing leaves, and the satisfaction of a full larder were the fleeting rewards of a year's hard work. Then came winter, the most challenging and often isolating season. Field work largely ceased as the ground froze and snow descended, often for months. The focus shifted indoors, survival through cold, managing dwindling supplies, and internal household chores. Firewood had to be split and hauled in constantly to keep the home warm. Animal feed needed careful rationing. Tools required repair, clothes needed mending, and many hours were spent on spinning and weaving. The days were short, the nights long and often intensely cold. This was a time of introspection, of close family confinement, and often of profound isolation, when contact with neighbors might be impossible. Sickness was more prevalent, and the risk of being cut off from help was high. The deep snows could be beautiful, but they also represented a formidable barrier, reinforcing the settlers' dependence on their own prepared resources. Beyond the major seasons, the more subtle natural cycles also governed life. The phases of the moon might influence planting schedules or hunting patterns. The migration of birds signaled impending weather changes. The availability of wild game or berries followed its own ecological calendar. This intimate connection to nature's rhythms meant that settlers possessed a highly developed observational skill, reading the land and sky for clues to their daily decisions. The concept of time itself was elastic. Punctuality, as we know it, was a luxury rarely afforded. Tasks took as long as they took, dictated by the weather, the strength of the animals, or the available daylight. A journey was measured not in hours, but in sunrises and sunsets. Progress was slow, incremental, often measured in the subtle growth of a field or the gradual improvement of a cabin. The future was not distant and abstract, but a tangible progression of seasons, each demanding its specific cycle of labor and preparation. This relentless, circular passage of time, dictated by the turning of the earth and the movements of the sun, was the ultimate framework for frontier life. It imposed an unyielding discipline, a constant reminder that human existence was inextricably tied to the natural world. There was no escaping its demands, only adapting to its rhythms. The daily grind, the constant foresight, and the cyclical nature of labor were all rooted in this deep, intuitive understanding of the seasons, making the frontier a timeless testament to humanity's ancient dance with the earth. We have journeyed through the intricate tapestry of daily life on the American frontier, from the foundational acts of building a shelter to the pervasive dictates of the seasons. We have lingered on the quiet hum of domestic labor, the relentless rhythm of the plow, the tenuous threads of communication, and the often unseen burdens on the human spirit. Now, as the sun dips below the horizon of this historical landscape, casting long shadows over the sod houses and log cabins we've explored, let us consider the enduring legacy of this ceaseless, often mundane, toil. The daily life of a frontier settler was, fundamentally, a monumental act of sustained effort. It was a life defined not by grand events, but by the accumulation of countless small, repetitive tasks. Each log notched, Each furrow turned, each garment mended, each meal prepared contributed to an edifice of survival built moment by painstaking moment. There was little room for idleness, little time for contemplation beyond the immediate practicalities of existence. This pervasive physicality forged a profound connection between the settler and their environment, a relationship of constant engagement, of both battle and deep dependence. The perceived rugged individualism of the pioneer, often celebrated in historical narratives, was in fact a complex interplay of self-reliance and community interdependence. While individual families certainly bore the brunt of daily labor, the very possibility of their success was often predicated on the nascent networks of mutual aid. The isolation that tested the mind also, paradoxically, imbued moments of human connection with immense value, making simple visits or shared meals events of profound significance. This life, so seemingly primitive by modern standards, was also a hotbed of practical innovation. Necessity, truly, was the mother of invention. Every repair, every adaptation of a tool, every new method for preserving food was a micro-innovation born of immediate need. This constant problem-solving, this persistent ingenuity in the face of scarcity, laid a foundational characteristic of American ingenuity, a deeply ingrained impulse to make do, to fix, and to create from whatever is at hand. The frontier was a vast, unforgiving laboratory where solutions were tested not in theory, but in the crucible of daily survival. The pervasive scarcity, the constant threat of natural disaster, disease, and economic ruin bred a unique form of resilience. Settlers learned to live with uncertainty, to cope with loss, and to find strength in perseverance. Their optimism, when it existed, was a hardened, practical optimism, rooted in the belief that another day of effort might bring a breakthrough, that the next harvest might be better, that the next season would bring new opportunities. This was not a passive endurance, but an active, hopeful persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. The passage of time on the frontier was not a linear progression towards a distant future, but a cyclical journey through the seasons. Life was intrinsically linked to the rhythms of the natural world, demanding specific actions at specific times, imparting an ancient, almost primordial understanding of human existence within a larger ecological framework. This deep attunement to nature's clock shaped their routines, their anxieties, and their profound appreciation for the simple abundance that a successful growing season could provide. The daily lives of these frontier settlers, far from being a collection of disparate anecdotes, formed the very bedrock of westward expansion and ultimately the shaping of a nation. The millions of individual acts of clearing land, building homes, tending crops, raising families, and enduring hardship cumulatively pushed the boundaries of settlement, established new communities, and transformed vast wildernesses into productive agricultural lands. The stories of battles and political decrees often dominate historical narratives, but it was the quiet, persistent grind of day-to-day existence that truly drove the engine of change. So, as we bring our journey to a close tonight, consider the profound weight of these ordinary lives. The frontier settlers' day was not filled with heroic exploits, but with the unromantic reality of endless chores, constant vigilance, and the pervasive awareness of their own vulnerability. Yet, it was precisely in this relentless, demanding mundanity that their true strength lay. It was a strength born of necessity, tempered by hardship, and fueled by a steadfast determination to simply, utterly survive and build a life from scratch. Let that thought settle in. The quiet endurance of those who built with their own hands, provided with their own labor, and faced down the vast unknowns, one dull, repetitive, yet ultimately transformative day at a time. May it offer you a sense of quiet reflection as you drift into your own moments of rest.